experiencing domestic violence. And so whether we realize it or not, most of us do know somebody has experienced or is experiencing domestic violence. It's really important to think about our own self-care as a priority when we're trying to support somebody. And part of that means not trying to deal with that situation alone, but finding trusted colleagues that we can talk to about our concerns and our worries. And just a reminder as we start out that small actions can make a big difference in somebody's life. And so it's never our responsibility to sort out somebody else's relationships or to tell them what to do. But it is important to treat everyone sensitively and to know that we don't have to know their whole story in order to be supportive and to be caring. And what we're proposing with this is that we learn how to create a culture of safety in our organizations and our workplaces. So the foundation of this training and a lot of other training that the center does to deal with domestic violence is really based on the work of the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. And so I'm sure that most of you know Dr. Peter Jaffe, my colleague. He's a founding member of that committee. And what it does is it looks at every single death that happens in the province of Ontario as a result of domestic violence. It tries to identify patterns, and then it makes recommendations for being able to prevent similar deaths in the future. And one of the most important findings of this committee, and it's repeated in every one of their reports, is that almost every time where we see somebody killed as a result of domestic violence, the people very close to the victim knew that something was going on. They either didn't know how serious it was, or they didn't really know what to do about it. And so the education that we're providing is not for experts. It's for everyday people who are close to those who are impacted by domestic violence. So we started with this campaign, Neighbours, Friends, and Families. It's exactly what the name says. It's meant to reach out to people, again, in our social circles who might be able to identify warning signs or recognize signs that danger is increasing. There's some tips on safety planning, but what we really encourage is to find out about sources of support in your own community and be able to refer somebody to those sources of support. And then we also had a component about talking to men who use abusive behavior. Now, we're sort of broadening our gender analysis as we go. This started back in 2005, and we certainly acknowledge that it's not just men who use abusive behavior, but we'll go into that a little bit later, but how we might want to try and reach out, not just to victim survivors, but also to those who use abusive behavior in their relationships. Some basics going into this, that domestic violence can happen to absolutely anybody. It's not a problem that just occurs with certain groups. It's not associated exclusively with certain faiths or certain cultures or certain socioeconomic groups of people. People of any gender can experience domestic violence. And we know that there are real cost to this, to our society. So this is the 7 billion was a 2011 estimate. So that's over 9 billion in our dollars of today. And that's just the cost that we actually can easily measure. The authors of that report acknowledge that there's a whole lot of costs that we were not able to measure because we're just not collecting that data. So the fundamental dynamic of domestic violence is control. And really what it's about is not so much the intent to harm somebody, although that's a consequence of the domestic violence. It's the attempt to control that person. Often people who are using abusive behavior feel entitled to be in control, to call the shots. And physical violence is the most easy to recognize sometimes, the most obvious, but it's certainly not the only form of domestic violence. And all forms cause harm. So what we're really talking about in a relationship where domestic violence is happening is a relationship where there's a power differential. So you may see instances where both people are trying to control each other, and that will certainly do harm to the relationship. What we're most focused on is a pattern of behavior where we see one partner really making every attempt to be in control of the whole relationship, and we call that coercive control. Some researchers have also referred to it as intimate terrorism. So when we see coercive control in relationships, we know that we have a risk for injury and even death. And we'll look at that a little bit further on in the presentation. We know that when injury and death occurs, it's most likely to be perpetrated by men against female partners. We also know that victim survivors who are in these abusive, controlling relationships live in fear and often change their behavior as a way of coping and managing the ongoing threat that they're under. So here are some statistics from the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, which started collecting data in 2002, and this is up into 2017. So we had in the province a total of 368 cases of domestic violence that resulted in 518 deaths. And I will just say that these are the cases that are reviewed by the committee. They don't review cases until they've cleared all criminal proceedings. And so we're always a little bit behind in terms of what can be reported on. So of those 368 cases, we had a total of 411 victims. And when you look at who died, 9% of the people who died were children, 81% of them were women, and 10% of them were men. Those were the victims who died. When you look at the perpetrators who died, 3% were women and 97% were men. So here we're starting to get a picture of how gendered this problem is, and particularly as we move into the most serious forms of the violence. In 35% of the cases, it was a homicide-suicide. We really need to understand the gender differences, how gender plays into domestic violence if we're going to be able to respond effectively. So we do know that men experience domestic violence. StatsCan tells us that. The survey that we conducted from the center that we'll talk about a little bit later in 2014 tells us that men also experience domestic violence. But we do know that women have higher rates, and we know that women are likely to suffer serious injuries. They're more likely to be hospitalized, more likely to fear for their lives. It's almost exclusively women who experience sexual violence, and it's much higher rates of women who die as a result of the violence. We just started to learn about trans people and their experience of domestic violence. All indicators are that they are at extremely high risk, maybe even higher than women. So in Ontario, we have the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability. It's a research and education institute. It does all their work online. Dr. Myrna Johnson, who is at Dr. Myrna Dawson from the University of Guelph runs this, and she collaborates very closely with us at CREVAC. So this is some data that we pulled from their site. About 12 women or girls are killed by every month in 2018. And when we look at the cause of death, more than half of those were as a result of intimate partner violence. We also had familiar family members being responsible for the deaths, friends and acquaintances, and sometimes strangers. But the majority were intimate partners responsible for those deaths. When we talk about coercive control, we're really talking about a whole system of behavior. So I mentioned earlier that physical violence might be the easiest to identify and what we most commonly associate with domestic violence. But we also need to think about sexual violence. We need to think about verbal and emotional violence, and so degrading threats to children, threats to take custody of children, threats to pets, economic violence, which could be controlling the family finances, making all the decisions about how money is spent, taking somebody's money. It can be spiritual violence, and so making somebody practice a faith that's not their own, or forbidding somebody from practicing their own spiritual or religious beliefs. And then we have stalking, which is actually a very high-risk behavior and something we should be concerned about if we notice. So now I'm going to show you a short video clip. We're going to meet Brian and Gail, and we're going to have the opportunity to go behind closed doors, which in real life we don't often have that opportunity to see what's happening in their relationship. We are not going to show you any physical violence, but nevertheless, the scene can be triggering. So please do what you need to look after yourself here. Sorry, we don't seem to have sound on the video. I think we're going to restart it. We did test it earlier and there was sound.
Where were you?
I thought we both agreed I should take as much overtime as possible until we found something.
You couldn't call?
I didn't want to wake you.
You're my wife, Gil. Man has a right to know where his wife is, don't you think? When you're not where you say you're going to be, I worry.
What are you worried about? Did you come by the residence again?
I did. And guess who wasn't there?
I sometimes have to cover other shifts at other sites. We've been over this.
Who were you with?
No one. I was working.
But you must have been working with someone. Well, maybe that guy, what's his name again?
Oh, come on. Seriously.
You know, you're not as clever as you think you are. What else have you been keeping from me?
Brian, I am not keeping anything from you.
Who are you going to Mexico with?
No one. I was going to tell you.
Do you think I'm stupid that I wouldn't find out?
No, of course not. No, it's for my birthday. Okay? I thought we both deserved to get away for a bit.
Oh, forget it.
I'm just so exhausted.
So don't you ever go behind my back again.
Okay, we're just going to get back to the presentation slides now. It'll just be a minute. As we're getting back, did you notice, what did you see there? Did you notice any warning signs? If anybody wants to put it in the chat or raise your hand, let me know. So we saw, yeah, thank you, Galen. Yeah, the paranoia, yeah, the suspicion, and jealousy too. Absolutely. Anybody else see anything there? Insecurity? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Asking accusatory questions. Yeah, absolutely. Just making assumptions. Unemployment. Thank you. Yeah. Putting the partner down. Totally. Not a respectful relationship. Controlling. Very controlling. Checking up on her. Yeah. Yeah. So, stalking. Yeah, going to her workplace. Absolutely. Absolutely. All of those things. Very, very concerning. And then you have his finger pointing at her at the end, the intimidation and the implied threat. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the fact that many men, when their behavior is escalating and the risk that they're going to cause serious harm, they often don't recognize that. So Dr. Katrina Scott, who's going to be joining our center soon, did a study a few years back with Changing Ways, which is a partner assault response program here in London. And they work with a group of really high risk men. And what they did was to wrap supports around them. If they needed housing support, they gave them housing support. If they had addiction problems, they got them help with that. They made sure that they weren't isolated. One of the things that they learned, these men had no idea, even though they scored very high on risk assessments, they had no idea that they were high risk. But what they found was by providing them with support, they were able to significantly de-escalate those situations. They were able to lower the risks that they presented, and they measured those effects out for several years, and they held. And so this is why we continue to say that it's really important. If you have a relationship, if it's your brother, if it's your friend, if it's your uncle, and you're noticing these signs that they are behaving abusively, you may be in a good position to be able to talk to them about that and suggest that it's a good time for them to get support for themselves. So I want to talk about domestic violence now coming to work. And when it does, there are warning signs and there are risk factors. And we should see those as critical events that raise the possibility of danger. Because we sometimes don't know what to look for, because we're unprepared to respond, because we are so used to thinking, well, this is a private matter, we're sometimes unprepared. And that can cause, that can lead to really tragic outcomes. And so I'm going to give the specific example of Lori Dupont, who was murdered at her workplace in Hotel du Grace Hospital in Windsor in 2005. And this is a chart that was presented at the Inquest. It was created by Peter Jaffe. And what it does is it documents all of the warning signs and risk factors. These are these blue bars that were recorded by her workplace, the hospital, in the 2 years leading up to her death. The darker bars are opportunities to intervene whenever these warning signs or risk factors presented themselves. And what we see are many more opportunities to intervene than we do warning signs, because oftentimes more than one person was witness to those risk factors and warning signs. Because that workplace was unprepared, this situation escalated to the point where Mark Daniel, the doctor, actually murdered Lori Dupont at their workplace. It was a tragic event. It was terrible for everybody. And I just need to emphasize that was not an uncaring workplace. It was an unprepared workplace. Nobody wanted that to happen. What we really want to be able to do is to intervene down here before things escalate, because the more the risk escalates, the more the behavior escalates, the harder it will be to intervene. So we want to be able to notice early on when we see those warning signs and risk factors. and be able to step in and take actions that are going to prevent the worst of the most serious outcomes. So as a result of Lord Dupont's death, Ontario was the very first jurisdiction, as far as I know, in the world to specifically name domestic violence as an occupational health and safety hazard. And our legislation actually says that employers who are aware or ought to be aware that domestic violence can expose a worker to physical injury that could occur in the workplace have to take every precaution reasonable to protect that worker. So we're under legal obligations. The way the occupational health and safety legislation works is that we have an internal responsibility system, and so the more authority you have, the more responsibility you have. The employer has to ensure compliance with the legislation. Supervisors have to protect workers from violence, and workers who are aware of violence or of threats have to report it. Yes, again, it's just like we have legal obligations to report child abuse. It's similar, but it's a little bit different because we don't, the obligation to report child abuse is to report to the Children's Aid Society. The obligation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to report is to report to somebody in the workplace who can do something about it. So a supervisor, to HR, if you have a specific response team set up, it would be to report to them. So the actual legal threshold for having to report is the exercise of violence, the attempt of violence, or the threat of violence. But really, we don't want to be waiting until you have physical violence happening. You want to be able to talk, if not report, at least consult with somebody when you're worried about a situation. You want to be able to be thinking, is there anything that we can do to actually reduce that risk, support that worker right now? I'm just going to quickly go over some of the results from the 2014 survey. So this was a first of its kind in Canada. We did it from the center. Dr. Nadine Wathen, who's over in FIMS, collaborated with this, and we collaborated with the Canadian Labour Congress. And so we had over 8,000 workers respond to this survey. What did we find? We found that fully a third of Canadian workers either have experienced domestic violence in the past or are experiencing it now, and that for over half of them, it followed them to work. And we found that women, transgender, and Indigenous respondents, people with disabilities, and a sexual orientation other than heterosexual had higher rates of domestic violence, and this is consistent with other research. Generally, our rates of domestic violence were consistent with our other large Canadian surveys. So we want to talk about, how does domestic violence come to work? Well, the most common way it comes is through abusive texts, messages, or phone calls. But we had, so 40% of workers said that was happening. 20% said that they were being stalked or harassed at or near the workplace. And then 18% said that their abusive partner or ex-partner was actually physically coming to the workplace. Then we asked whether or not they had told anybody at the workplace about this. And so overall, 43% of workers said they had told somebody. Not surprisingly, they were most likely to talk to their coworkers. But a good number had also talked to supervisors. At the time, 12% had talked to unions. Since then, unions have done a lot of work on this. They're really paying attention, and they're trying to build their own capacity to support their members. And so I think that number might be higher now. And 10% had talked to HR. I think, again, HR, a lot of work is being done. And so maybe a little bit more than that number may have risen as well at this point. Not surprisingly, we found that almost 82% of workers who had experienced domestic violence said it had a negative impact on their work performance. So this is our framework that I'm going to go through. What we want to do is we want to teach you first how to recognize warning signs that danger is increasing. We want to show how you can respond, not as an expert, not as a therapist, but just as a supportive coworker. And we want to talk a little bit about where you can refer. So that's what we're going to get into now. So again, we're going to follow Gail to her workplace, and we're going to now see a conversation between Gail and her supervisor at her workplace. Again, I just want you to think about what you're seeing, about possible warning signs that the supervisor is picking up on. And we'll go to the video now.
Yeah.
Sure. What's up?
I noticed you signed in late again tonight.
Oh yeah, I got stuck in that traffic. There's construction on.
That's not the only thing that concerns me. I've been looking over your attendance for the last 3 months. You've used all your sick days, and then some. And where's your husband? Complaints about him haranguing the front desk staff, showing up here all hours.
He just really worries about me when I work late.
It's not just when you work late. I saw him out there yesterday afternoon when you picked up that early shift.
I'm sorry. He's been out of work, so it's been real tough on him.
And you, imagine. I'm not sure what to tell you, Gail, but your performance is starting to negatively affect our residents, and that we can't have. I understand the other night when you were on the phone with your husband, Mrs. Price was left waiting in her wheelchair for over an hour. So do whatever you have to do. If you need to get some help, talk to somebody, or take some time off, please do so sooner rather than later. Okay. Have a good night.
You too.
Okay, while we go back to the PowerPoint, I just want to make it clear that I'm not putting that out there as an ideal response. We're going to look at some warning signs that might have come up, and I'll put the list up, and if you want to respond in the chat to any of the signs on the list that you actually saw in the video. So did you see absences, sick days, lateness, trouble concentrating, working slowly, trouble making decisions, requests to change shifts or work locations, or just was Gail struggling with her work duties? If you want to just respond, which one else you saw? All of the above. Yeah, we did see, we saw quite a bit of that. You're absolutely. So it was a very many warning signs, and the supervisor absences, late, struggling with duties. Yes, thanks, Megan. How about the next? Do we see any changes in her behavior? Was she working late even when it wasn't required? Or did she seem anxious, withdrawn, or afraid? Or do we know she was using drugs or alcohol to cope? Anybody see anything here in her behavior? Working late. Yeah, she looked withdrawn. I do think that she was anxious and pretty nervous. And if you know somebody, it would be easier to pick that up and be able to say that with certainty. How about signs of psychological or financial violence? Disrespected by their partner, limited autonomy, doesn't seem to have money even though they're working or can't make independent financial decisions. And we have seen also another scene with Gail where we may have gotten some insight into some of this. Limited autonomy, yes. He didn't want her working with any male co-workers, absolutely. Husband was unemployed, yes. Yes. Too much, yes. And he did disrespect her. Absolutely, he did. Also, he was making all of the yes, her supervisor did note that he was waiting for outside the workplace. Absolutely. And we saw that, Gail had wanted to book a trip for Mexico for both of them, but she wasn't really able to do that. So he's also making financial decisions, even though she's the one that's working. Do we see any signs of physical violence? Anybody have an opinion about that? We didn't necessarily see any signs of physical violence, and it's just a reminder that not yet. You're exactly right, and it's also a reminder that the violence, the control that Gail's experiencing. Yes, long sleeves could be the uniform. Good point. It's even if she's not being physically harmed, she is experiencing quite a bit of harm. She is being harmed. So the supervisor was talking about warning signs, but not treating them as warning signs. Basically, he was treating them as performance problems. So, given the way that he dealt with the situation, what do you think Gail's most likely to do next? You can just type it in the chat. Tell her husband to stop coming to her workplace, hide what's happening, lose her job. Lose her job. Yeah, if things keep going the way it is, yeah, it didn't seem like the supervisor cared. Yeah, loser. She's on a path towards losing her job if things continue as they are. I completely agree with that. And then that's going to put her even at more risk. She's the only person that's earning an income. It's likely to make him quite upset. But at the same time, we're losing opportunities to reach out and support her if she's no longer in the workplace. Yeah, she will hide what's happening, and that will lead to her losing her job. Absolutely right. I completely agree. So just want to go back to the point about escalation. In any situation where we recognize any warning signs, there's always a risk. But when we start to see that pattern of warning signs, then we know that the risk is increasing. And so oftentimes we're going to want to consult with experts to really have a handle on the level of risk. So we can turn to our local women's shelter here in London. It would be Inova. If the victim survivor is willing, we can involve the police. You're going to find that most times they're not willing, or at least not immediately willing to involve police. And that's why we want to rely on community partners like women's shelters. When we talk about escalation, we're talking about an escalation in the frequency of the violence, the intensity of the violence, and also increasing impacts of violence. So now I want to look specifically at signs that the risk is increasing. So we saw the warning signs, and then there's signs that the danger is getting greater. And so out of here, was there history of domestic violence? Do we know if the violence included choking or any other actions that could lead to serious injury or death? Or had there been a recent escalation? Do we have the partner, do we have Brian controlling most of our activities? Either because he was jealous or other reasons? And do we have the partner monitoring her whereabouts and stalking? You want to write in your chat any of those signs of increasing risk. Stalking, absolutely. As I mentioned, it's a very serious risk sign that we really need to take into consideration. The other one, yes, thank you, Julie. We did see Brian controlling her and monitoring, and so really, even though she's at work and he's at home, he's trying to, really monitor and control what she does, even when she's not with him. Do we see any threats to kill, or do we have any indication that Gail thinks that she might be killed? In this scene, we didn't really see that. Not at this point. You're right about that. If somebody says that they're worried that they'll be murdered, we really have to pay attention to that. Research shows that about half of women who have been murdered thought that their partner could kill them. The other half of women, though, that were murdered thought that they could manage the situation and didn't realize their own risk. So if somebody says, I think I'm at risk of being killed, then we need to take that seriously and believe them. If we are seeing other risk factors and they say, no, it's all okay, I can manage this, we can't assume that they're safe. It is a scary thing. It is, and I don't want to. Thank you for pointing that out. I don't want to scare you with this. I want to give you information, because the more information we have, the more able we're going to be able to manage situations, provide support, and prevent those worst outcomes. So once a situation of domestic violence has been confirmed, if the person experiencing violence is thinking about leaving or is in the process of leaving their partner or has recently left, we know that escalates risk. And in fact, the majority of survivors who are murdered, victims who are murdered in that period of separation. If the ex-partner has been using alcohol or drugs excessively, that's an additional risk. If the unemployment is an additional risk, access to a gun is an additional risk, being depressed is an additional risk, as is talk of suicide, attempts of suicide. And yeah, important to know what to do. And we will get to that. So if we just look at this risk, and the terrible situation in Nova Scotia, we haven't heard much in the media reported yet about domestic violence, but there have been a few reports that do say that his primary victims, first victims, was his ex and her new partner. And so that would be a period of separation. Other media reports reported that he was using alcohol. He had a problem with alcohol. He was unemployed because of COVID. He had access to a gun. And we're not sure whether there were reports of him being suicidal or depressed. That's quite possible as well. So that's a situation that's still evolving, although I suspect that we might see some of that come out in the media in the near future. We also want to be able to consider whether or not there's a risk while she's at work or while the survivor is at work. And so we want to ask questions like, does the partner or ex-partner regularly contact the workplace to check up on her? Those phone calls, text messages, emails. Have they threatened to come to the workplace, or have they actually shown up at the workplace? Is the worker who's experiencing domestic violence afraid for their safety while they're at work? And have there been threats to harm the worker at work or co-workers? Those are things that we want to take into consideration. Have they violated no contact conditions to show up at work? And if there's been a separation, is the workplace now the only place that the ex-partner can find the survivor? And there are cases in 2004 in Ontario. There's a teacher, Asha Gulkandir, killed at Bramley Secondary School. She had separated from her partner. She had put a safety plan in place for herself in the community, moved to a new building with a secure entrance, but he was still able to find her at work, and he shot and killed her in the parking lot, where at least one student witnessed what was happening, and the whole school ended up in lockdown. So just a traumatic experience for everybody. So when we're making those safety plans, we have to make sure that we include the workplace. So we saw he, again, our supervisor, recognizing signs of increasing risk, but just seeing it as a problem and not really addressing those as signs of danger for Gail. So he missed a lot of opportunities there to be able to have a conversation with Gail that would be more supportive and put her in touch with people both inside the workplace and in the community who could help to manage that risk. So we want to now look a little bit at responding, and we've developed a little framework for responding. We call it See It, Name It, Check It, SNCit conversations. The reason why these simple conversations are so important is because isolation is always a dynamic of abuse. So we saw that in Gail's relationship, where he doesn't want her to be in touch with other people. So the more we can break through that isolation, that's where our ability to increase safety lies, is in breaking through that isolation. So we know that abusive people discourage their partner from having relationships with other people, whether it's friends, even family members, co-workers. We know that if there's children in those households, they don't bring their friends home. And we know that when many times in our social networks, if people start to notice those signs of abuse in a relationship, they become uncomfortable and they stop inviting, they stop reaching out to the couple, so that it just reinforces the isolation. So abuse and isolation are closely tied together. Isolation is a risk factor of abuse, but it's also a result of abuse. And the more we see isolation deepening, the more we see that abuse intensifying. They're like tied together, the two dynamics. So as I said, our strategy is not to make somebody leave their abusive relationship. It's not to take over their life. It's to reduce their isolation, and that's how we can increase safety. So we're going to do that through these very simple conversations. And our goal in this conversation isn't to make somebody do something they want to do. Our goal is to open the door so that we can provide support. So the see it part we've gone through, it's a recognizing warning signs, it's recognizing risk factors. The naming part is being able to say to somebody, this is what I see happening. We're not going to speculate about things that we don't know. We're not going to be judgmental. We're going to be very matter of fact, very to the point, and stick to the facts of what we know. And then we're going to check in. Are you okay? Is there anything that I can do to help? Do you know that we have a workplace policy that can provide you with supports? So this is our framework. See it, name it, check it. So for example, if we were going to have a see it, name it, check it with Gail, we might say, Brian called work to check up on you again. I'm worried about you. Are you okay? Are you worried about his behavior? So we're just sticking to the facts and we're keeping it short. We're not trying to be therapists. Let's give the supervisor another chance and see if he can do a think it, name it, check it conversation. We're going to go to the next video. He did offer for her to talk to somebody. He did. You're right. He might be able to do a little bit more than that. Let's see. Can we restart with the sound?
And you.
He's been out of work lately, so it's been real rough on him.
And you, I imagine. I hope you don't mind me saying so, but I'm a little concerned about you. The way your husband's acting isn't healthy. Is keeping tabs on you when you leave the house, calling to check up on you while you're here. He's out of work, and I know he's going through a rough time, but I have to make sure that you're okay through all this. So I think the best way forward would be to get in touch with Yasmin in HR. She can work with the Health and Safety Committee and the local women's shelter and do a risk assessment. It may be overly cautious, and I hope it is, but that way you have a safety plan in place if and when you need it. So I'll give her a call as soon as I get back to the office, and I'll make sure that she checks in with you before you finish up your shift tonight. Okay?
Okay. Thanks.
So much better. Okay. Yeah. So while we're waiting to go back to the PowerPoint, what did you think of that? What was the impact of that conversation on Gail? How do you think she would have felt this time? And if you want, what was different this time from the first conversation that he had with her? Yes, yeah, I do. I think you're right. I think she would have felt supported. And the first time he really left her on her own to manage the situation. This time he's saying, we have things in place in the workplace, and we are going to take steps to support you. He expressed concern for her well-being instead of focusing on the concerns about her work performance. Absolutely. He was seeing the problem for what it was. And with our occupational health and safety legislation, as you remember, employers have to take every precaution reasonable. So as soon as they know that it's domestic violence, they can't just do performance management. They have to provide the support, create the safe workplace first. That's our obligation. I will say that sometimes, yeah, it could have made her feel like somebody cares and was willing to listen. Absolutely. Sometimes when I do trainings and I show this video, people are worried that he went too far. But given the context of our legislation in Ontario, he has to name those warning signs. He has to name them for what they are, those risk factors, and he's obligated to take action. Now, she may be a little worried about what's going to happen, but I think if she can be assured that her job is not on the line and the whole purpose of the intervention is to provide support, then she's going to be able to accept that support and stop hiding things, which makes it much more possible to plan for safety, not just of Gail, but of her coworkers, and in this case, of the residents in that care facility where she works. So this is a little bit of a review, but Gail was trying to manage the escalating situation on her own. You can't make her tell her anything. The only way that you can gain her confidence is by being supportive. And you really want her to have open communication with you, because things change. If she decides to leave him, for example, you need to know that, because you're going to need to make a change in the safety plan that's in place. So again, we're not expecting anybody in the Faculty of Ed to be an expert in safety planning. We have community experts. If you call ANOVA and you ask them for a help with developing a safety plan, this is what they do every single day, and they'll be more than willing to assist. So I'm not going to say that these conversations are easy, because we're so used to considering this a private matter. We're so used to not wanting to interfere in people's personal lives. But the way that we can prepare ourselves to have these difficult and likely very awkward conversations is just to start from a place of genuine concern. And so we may not always say things exactly right. We may not always have all the answers, but if we just start from a place of, I care about you, I want to offer support, we're going to get through those awkward conversations, and we're not going to break the trust. So the final piece that I want to go over is to refer. And so we want to be referring to the workplace policy, we want to be referring to internal experts, and we want to be referring to external experts. So you all in the Faculty of Education, you have the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, right down the hall from wherever you are, and you always can come to us, and we will always help you problem solve a situation. Western does have a policy, and I've mentioned ANOVA several times. There are great resources as well. So we can use the recognize, respond, and refer as a tool in that internal responsibility system that occupational health and safety legislation lays out for us. We want to first ask, what are the warning signs and what are the risk factors? And then we want to respond, taking every precaution reasonable in the circumstances. And I can't give you a list of actions to take, because it really is going to be, every situation needs to be evaluated, and we need to have a very specific plan to address that set of circumstances. And then in referring, we need to ask who else needs to be involved. And I just will say about this, we can never guarantee confidentiality if somebody discloses domestic violence. And sometimes that the survivor will want that, they will ask for that. What we can guarantee is that only those people who need to know in order to assure safety will know. And so we want to think carefully through who we go to so that we're not involving more people than we need to in order to assure safety. So this is our ever precaution, reasonable, ready flow chart. We see a critical event, warning signs and risk factors. We have our see it, name it, check it conversation. And then we go to those who are responsible for safety. We want to have at the end of that a safety plan. And we get to a safety plan through doing a risk assessment. So we're actually evaluating the risks of that specific situation and creating a safety plan that is going to manage those risks. We do that in consultation with experts. Here's a link to our website, makeitourbusiness.com. There are all kinds of resources on there. They're downloadable. They're free to share. You can take them, refer to them at any time. So I think we can open it up now to questions, comments, reflections.
Oh, the audio is now shared, so participants can raise their hand and speak if they click on the mic icon in the center bottom of the screen. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to all of this. This is really, really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. I really appreciate that you showed up.
I think sometimes it really does sort of take that third-party perspective. Like if you're in the thick of it, you probably don't even know how bad things are.
I think that's really, really true. And that's part of a coping strategy, right? Like if you're in a really abusive relationship and you actually acknowledge how bad things are, it can just be overwhelming, especially if you don't have a source of support.
As coworkers or colleagues of someone that and you're suspecting, is it more helpful to just speak to? Because I know you mentioned how it's like under the illustration, like they have to ask and just make sure that there's that they're ensuring safety of their employees. But as coworkers, you know, without particularly making it seem like you're overstepping into someone else's business, is it just better to then just go to the supervisor always, or attempt to talk?
I think it depends a little bit on the kind of relationship that you have with your coworker. And so if you have somewhat of a relationship, I think it's a good, if you're able to say, you know, I noticed that you're getting a lot of phone calls, you really seem upset. Are you okay? Is there anything that I can do? Do you know about the supports that are available? If you can have that kind of conversation, that's great. But if you just don't feel comfortable having that conversation, if you don't think it would go well, but you still have those concerns, then I think it is a good idea just to have that conversation with your supervisor. The thing that we don't want to do is ignore it and hope it'll go away.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I'll say, if anybody, if we ever get back to work, please walk down to the center, have a conversation with us about this at any time. And also, if you come up with questions, feel free to email me. I'm here.
All right. If there's no further questions, then we'll just take a minute to thank Barb and thank you everybody who is in the audience. Our next faculty seminar will be Wednesday, May 27th. Dr. Brenton Faubert about strategic triaging, consensus building, and structural change. How the Canadian, German, and Swiss Ministerial Councils / Conferences of Education address issues of national importance. All right. Thanks, Barb. Thanks, Rupreet.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Rashid. Thanks for all the support and the help.
That was a great lecture. Thanks, Barb.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.